So, chapter 41. This chapter is Fergus and Edward walking from Holyrood Palace to the place that Fergus is lodging at. As soon as they've left the palace, he asks Edward, what do you think of the prince? And Edward says he is, I'm going to have to find this, he is a prince to live and die under. Fergus says, yes, I knew you'd think that, and yet he has his foibles. And one thing he says is he has his Irish officers. Now, I actually intended to follow that note, so I might do that here, because I am quite interested in all things Irish. Divisions early showed themselves in the Chevalier's little army, not only among the independent chieftains, who were far too proud to brook subjection to each other, but betwixt the Scotch and Charles's governor O'Sullivan, an Irishman by birth, who with some of his countrymen, bred in the Irish Brigade in the service of the King of France, had an influence with the adventurer, much resented by the Highlanders, who were sensible that their own clans made the chief, or rather the only, strength of his enterprise. I've now looked up John O'Sullivan. He actually called himself John Sullivan. It's only other people that called him John O'Sullivan, so to me that makes him John Sullivan. He's an interesting person. He is part of the general movements in Ireland that I have researched a lot. I hadn't quite come across him. He was born in Kerry, which was the heart of resistance against the invading British. So that's no surprise. And when he grew up, he went to France. A lot of Irish Catholics did this. At this time in Ireland, England was still trying to stamp out all the resistance, and part of doing this was to deny them access to quite a few professions, which made it very hard for Irish Catholics to even make ends meet. Now, a lot of Irish Catholics were uneducated farmers, but there was a huge number of them who were completely educated, wealthy people who had fled England in the previous century. They had everything to lose. They were equally caught up in England's attempt to stamp out Irish rebellion and ended up on the side of the Irish Catholic natives. John Sullivan was one of those people. He went to France, and the King of France, whoever the King of France at the time was, always had a whole regiment for Irish soldiers, so they kind of went to a second home when they went over to France. John Sullivan was one of the people who did that. He moved up in the military ranks there, and for the 1745 rebellion, he came across to Scotland with Charles Stewart. So he is the man who the Scottish people don't like, because although they're kind of united in their hatred of the English, there's a whole lot of animosity between the Scottish and the Irish as well. There have been times in the past, or there had been times in the past, when England used Scottish troops to come over and subdue the Irish. There had also been times when Irish people fled Ireland and went into Scotland and disrupted matters for the Scottish people there. So from the outside, they're all a bunch of very argumentative people. Now, this is actually the only reason they're still fighting. Otherwise, they would have just given in and succumbed to British rule. The fact is they are argumentative. That is what has kept them independent. That is the trait that has enabled them to fight for their sovereignty, to fight for their independence, to fight for the survival of their culture and their language. So although they all have the same grudge against the English, it makes perfect sense that they're going to be niggling at each other as well, and there's a lot of suspicion, and each one of them would prefer that they were the top dog under Prince Charles. So that's what he is dealing with here, and this is the man Sullivan. There was a feud also between Lord George Murray and James Murray of Broughton, the Prince's secretary, whose disunion greatly embarrassed the affairs of the adventurer. In general, 1,000 different pretensions divided their little army, so I guess that's plain enough. But to paraphrase, what I get from that is that it was the Scottish clans that were basically providing the men in the army. They were the entire strength, and they didn't want to take orders from Irish generals who actually weren't bringing anybody to the fight but themselves. Fergus then says it was a good move to turn down the brevet major. There are 2 ranking positions currently vacant. The Scottish chieftains have somebody in mind for one of them, and the other one the Irish party have someone in mind for. So if Edward had been placed in one of them, there would have been extra feuds between the two factions over who was going to go into the remaining position. Fergus then said he's surprised that the prince only offered Edward the rank of brevet major when many who have less to offer wouldn't settle for anything less than lieutenant colonel. But that's just Fergus doing a bit of politics. He finishes by saying, "We must have you regularly equipped for the evening in your new costume, for to say the truth, your outward man is scarcely fit for a court." So they go back to Fergus's place. Fergus is lodging in the house of a woman called Mrs. Flockhart. Scott describes her as a buxom widow of 40. Calum Begg is in the house. Fergus tells Calum to go call his tailor because Edward needs clothes. The next few pages are all about dressing Edward. Edward is to be dressed in the McKeever plaid and a blue bonnet of the prince's pattern. Fergus concludes, "My short green coat with silver lace and silver buttons will fit him exactly." This is not for general wear, this is for court, because apparently tonight the prince is holding an official assembly and they want Edward to be at it. Edward now has the chance to tell Fergus everything that happened. Fergus is pretty sure that it was Donald the Bandit behind everything, but he says that he was not aware of it himself. He also says he's not very happy with Donald. Donald has been going around collecting the blackmail as he's meant to, but also getting extra blackmail just on his own behalf. And he further thinks that it was Donald the Bandit playing the part of the peddler who joined Gilfillan's party and first gave the signal for the highwayman. However good he is at disguise, wouldn't Edward have recognised him? And even if he didn't at the time, later on, when he recognised Donald Durock and saw Alice, wouldn't it have then occurred to him that maybe that was Donald? I don't see how he could disguise himself that completely. I mean, fair enough, he can disguise his appearance, but there are other characteristics to people than just how they're dressed and how they look. And apparently Fergus didn't know anything about Edward's adventures until the prince told him this evening. After this is all out of the way, Edward asks where Flora is. Fergus is still not ready to introduce him to her. Fergus says she's residing in the city. In fact, she and Rose are both staying together in Edinburgh. "I thought it better she should come here," meaning to Edinburgh, "as since our success a good many ladies of rank attended our military court, and I assure you that there is a sort of consequence annexed to the near relative of such a person as Flora McKeever, and where there is such a justling of claims and requests, a man must use every fair means to enhance his performance," meaning he would benefit from Flora's presence here. The reason he says this doesn't come out very clearly here, and I don't think it's meant to, but he's just saying that Flora has more influence than he does, so he'd like her to be here so that he can benefit from that. There was something in this last sentence which grated on Waverley's feelings. He could not bear that Flora should be considered as conducing to her brother's preferment by the admiration which she must unquestionably attract. Fergus doesn't realise that Edward is feeling this way, and it doesn't really matter in the scheme of things anyway. Fergus does then say he doesn't think it's wise for Edward and Flora to meet until they're actually at the Prince's Assembly this evening, at which point it's pretty clear he knows that she can't actually decline to see him because it would be rude, it would be noticeable. So he's counting on that to force them together. He doesn't quite say it like that to Edward, and Edward doesn't seem to pick that up at all. They eat lunch in Fergus's lodgings. Balmawhapple is there, but he doesn't stay. And the Baron of Bradwardine, who does stay. So Edward has lunch with Fergus and Tully and the Bailey McWeeble and Calum Begg, I think, is still there. Actually, no. Calum Begg has gone to sit with the tailor because apparently Fergus's tailor is a very good tailor as long as he doesn't drink anything, and Calum is staying there to keep all alcohol away until he has finished Edward's clothes. The Baron is very pleased that Edward has taken up the cause of the prince. He then says that Rose is in the city staying with Flora. It looks like battle is looming for them all. And I know this seems mad that I didn't see this coming, but, you're never really sure. Even though Edward is here and there's cannon fire and things like that, I don't really feel close enough to all the events to be sure of what's going on and what's going to happen next. But apparently this is kind of the last day before they go into battle proper, in defence of Holyrood Palace, I suppose. Tully talks about how Tully Veolan was getting so dangerous and that's why he brought Rose here. It seems like a really odd choice. I mean, here is Edinburgh with the prince is here, the enemy is here, there's cannon fire, there's all this stuff going down. How can this be safer for Rose? I can see that Tully Veolan maybe wasn't. She was there alone with those soldiers. It looks like maybe the soldiers have left, or at the very least they were happy for somebody to take Rose away. But Edinburgh doesn't seem any safer. It would appear that Rose thinks the same. Apparently she's been very unsettled since she got there and very afraid of all the cannon fire going on around her. Tully says he has assured her she's perfectly safe where she is, but she's not so convinced. And then they sit down to eat a meal. And that's the end of the chapter. We didn't really get into anybody's heads in this chapter, so once again there's not really much to comment on. It's just the meeting of old friends, Fergus and Tully and Edward, all here together. Any quarrel there ever was is in the past. There is just this hint of politics going on behind the scene, once again of Edward not really knowing what's going on. But since he was so aware in the last chapter of the weaknesses in Bally's troop, I'm starting to wonder if he is unaware. I'm wondering if the things that Scott is showing us are things that Edward understands. No, I don't think so. Because I don't think he would be acting the same way or thinking the same way. So we just happen to know that there are issues in the Prince's court among some of the people that have come together to support him. And it's very clear that Fergus isn't the only one who's anticipating an earldom out of it. Many people are here for their own self-interest. That's really all I can say about this chapter, so I'll go on. Chapter 42. This chapter is a dinner. And when I say dinner, I think it's probably a late lunch, actually. It's an early dinner. It's taking place at Fergus's lodgings. The clothes are back. Edward is dressed in his new finery. He's very impressed by how he looks. As Scott says, his light brown hair, for he wore no periwig, notwithstanding the universal fashion of the time, became the bonnet which surmounted it. His person promised firmness and agility, to which the ample folds of the tartan added an air of dignity. His blue eyes seemed of that kind which melted in love and which kindled in war. And that's a line of poetry in the Scots fashion of the time. And an air of bashfulness, which was in reality the effect of want of habitual intercourse with the world, gave interest to his features without injuring their grace or intelligence. This description, I mean, it's nice that he didn't kind of shoehorn it in at the start, but I feel like this description should have come a bit earlier than chapter 42. This far into the book, we finally know what he looks like. Evan Dhu is here. He's not called Evan Dhu any longer. He is now Ensign McCombish. And Evan Dhu is talking to Mrs. Flockhart. He says he's a pratty man, a very pratty man. By this, apparently, Evan means that he looks clean-made and like a proper lad of his quarters. He looks soldierly, he looks gentlemanly, he looks brave enough. Evan, I think, is not speaking personally, but politically. So then there's a little bit more banter between them because Evan Dhu is ever the one for banter, and he goes off in a whole spiel of Scottish English, and it's quite clear that he's now on first name terms with Mrs. Flockhart's servants. So they all sit down to a meal. The meal is just a lot of chatter, eating and drinking. At the end of the they seem to get a bit morose. They're starting to think about the battle to come because this apparently is their last meal before they go into battle. Like, they've got this meal and then they're off to the official reception at Holyrood Palace. And after that, the next day, presumably the fighting starts. So they're starting to get a bit maudlin even, which I presume means that they're drinking a bit. There was mention of brandy. They're talking about whether they should live or die and what will happen to their families if they die. And Tully thinks that Rose will be utterly undefended and he hopes somebody will look out for her. Bailey McWeeble goes into a good old bawling session, which I gather is perfectly acceptable. This is just how it should be the night before a battle. He set up a lamentable howl. If that doleful day should come while Duncan McWeeble had the sheet, for she kenned what it was to want. He's talking about Rose here. If indeed all the bonny barony of Bradwardine and Tully Veolan with it, on and on and on. Anyway, he's crying and he's saying, oh gosh, if the Baron should die, I'll look after Rose for you, I'll keep her safe. And the beginning of this lamentation apparently was quite affecting, but he went on a bit long. So they cheer him up, they pack up the table and they go off to the Prince's assembly. This wasn't a bad chapter. Action-wise, it was a bit limited, but it did set the mood. You do get the feel of old friends come together, being aware that this might be for the last time. There's kind of a mix of levity and solemnity and the drinking and the eating. And Mrs. Flockhart is also getting very teary at the thought of all these gentlemen going off to war. But at the same time, all of them, Scott tells us, have these moments where they're sort of thinking about the gains and what it's worth to them all. So, yeah, a good chapter. Definitely the right chapter to have here. If tomorrow really is the battle day, and I wish they'd made that a bit clearer to me, because as the reader, I'm still not sure, but it's looking like that. So if tomorrow is the day when they live or die, as it were, this is a great final meal. And I'll leave it there. Chapter 43. The sun is going to go down soon. It's getting quite late. So I'm going to try and whip through this chapter very fast, which I probably can't because a lot happened. This chapter is the assembly. So they all head off in their finery to Holyrood Palace. They were announced respectively as they entered the apartments. Scott says something here that I guess he's presuming the readers understand, but I don't. It is but too well known how many gentlemen of rank, education and fortune took a concern in the undertaking of 1745. I've actually paraphrased there. I've missed a couple of words out because I feel like they were too much spoilers, and they shouldn't be there. To me, I don't like spoilers. I don't like any hint of what might come. It was probably a hard call for Scott. He knew how it turned out. He'd be assuming that everybody who reads this knew how it turned out, which I guess they did. But I'm going to deviate from being a reader of the time and be myself now reading it a bit over 200 years later. I don't know how events turned out. I vaguely do, but I don't exactly know how they went down. So I'm going to read this not knowing. Scott is expecting us to know how many gentlemen of rank were here. At first I thought that it wasn't many. I thought that's what he was saying. There was mostly an uprising of the uneducated Highlanders. But I'm thinking maybe there were a fair few gentlemen of education and fortune involved. He says the ladies also of Scotland very generally espoused the cause of the gallant and handsome young prince, who threw himself upon the mercy of his countrymen rather like a hero of romance than a calculating politician. I think actually this is why Scott chose Edward to be his hero, because Prince Charles's support is either people there for their own self-interest who don't really care who's ruling their country, who their ruler is, as long as they've got what they want out of it, and people who are inspired by the romance of the event, like Edward. people who are inspired by the romance of the event, like Edward. And that, it seems, is mostly the women. Prince Charles has a sort of celebrity status here, and he's sort of got the pull that a celebrity might have. So when they reach the assembly, they've been announced, they go in, and now Fergus takes Edward over to Flora. And Edward was looking for Flora from the very second he entered the room. He sees her with a group around her. Fergus takes him over, and Flora greets him very coldly. Flora seemed a very little, affected and discomposed at his approach. "I bring you an adopted son of Ivor," said Fergus. "And I receive him as a second brother," said Flora. There was a slight emphasis on the word, which would have escaped every ear but one that was feverish with apprehension. It was, however, distinctly marked, and, combined with her whole face and manner, plainly intimated, "I will never think of Mr. Waverley as a more intimate connection." Edward stopped, bowed, and looked at Fergus, who bit his lip. A movement of anger which proved that he also had put a sinister interpretation on the reception which his sister had given his friend. "This, then, is an end of my daydreams," Edward thought. And he's so distraught that he is visibly upset. He goes very pale. "Good God," said Rose Bradwardine. She was standing beside Flora, but he hardly ever saw her until now. "Good God," said Rose Bradwardine, "he has not yet recovered." These words, which she uttered with great emotion, were overheard by the Chevalier himself, who stepped hastily forward, and taking Waverley by the hand, inquired kindly after his health, and added that he wished to speak with him. So the Prince takes Edward out of the room, just into a sort of an ante-room next door. For the next little while, he talks to him about families in England and who is who and who might be a supporter and who might not. Scott sort of leaves it up to us to decide whether he actually wants to know the details of these families or whether he's actually just doing this to keep Edward out of the way. But later on, it sort of becomes clear that there is some politics involved here. Scott absolutely doesn't want Edward to seem fallible and maybe not effeminate either. He's obviously built Edward up to be something of a hardened soldier, so he doesn't need Edward standing here looking like a lovelorn puppy. That would ruin everything. So that's obviously some of the reason why he's taken him out of the room. But he probably does want to know these details, which Edward can't give him because Edward is so overcome with misery at the moment. And at the end, after about 15 minutes or so, the Prince is sort of watching him and obviously perceiving his emotions. We're not really told what he thinks of them, just that he's perceiving them, and he does have some thought about them, obviously. He suggests to Edward that he doesn't show his feelings quite so obviously, which is probably something Edward shouldn't have needed to be told anyway. So with this bit of rallying advice, Edward goes back out into the reception area and rejoins Flora and Rose's party, and for the rest of the evening he's very, very social and he's very successful. He speaks to a whole lot of people, he says the right things, he's very elegant, very charming. He does it so well that Scott tells us even Flora might have had a moment's qualms at having been so decided against him. And very definitely Rose is absolutely full of watching him and admiring him. It says that Rose is watching him without any jealousy. She's happy to be near him even though he doesn't speak to her himself, which I'm sure was very laudable in this decade and exactly how the demure woman was supposed to be. It actually took several pages to say all that in here. It doesn't seem as though Edward actually said a word to Rose. I mean, maybe at first he did, but I don't think so, because I think as soon as he got there, he was looking at Flora, and Fergus introduced him, and they had that little bit of an exchange, and then the Prince whisked him out, and although he's come back, it was just, I don't know. And then the dancing begins. Edward dances, everybody dances. Maybe he danced with Rose, I don't know. He certainly didn't dance with Flora, but the Prince danced with Flora. And I think here, this is actually what Fergus meant. When Fergus said that he could benefit from Flora's presence in Edinburgh, I think maybe Flora actually gets on quite well with the prince. Obviously, Fergus doesn't have any thought of a match between them. And, I don't actually know about this prince. He might be married already. I'll have to put in here if I figure out that he was married at this time. Okay, I've looked him up now. Charles Edward Stewart was single at the time of the 1745 uprising. In fact, he had troubles with relationships all of his life. That does seem to have begun here. A cursory look at his life makes it rather clear that he was bred to this. He was bred to believe that he would take back the British throne, and everything in his upbringing leads to this. Probably somewhere deep in his heart, he just didn't think that it could fail, because it's meant to be, because he is the rightful king and God wouldn't abandon him. But certain issues that occur over the next year or two of his life that aren't included in this book lead to him becoming an alcoholic and a rather depressed man. Now, regarding marriage, he actually met somebody in Scotland. It's believed that he met them on this very expedition at the 1745 uprising. He later went back to France and had a relationship with his cousin, who was a married woman, and she bore a child to him. That was a major scandal. He was consequently expelled from the French court. That also is not part of this book at all. But after his expulsion from the court, he then went back to Scotland and moved in with his Scottish mistress. Her name was Clementina Walkinshaw, and she was exactly the same age as him, born in 1720 to good Scottish parents. But although her parents were Scottish, her father had taken part in the 1715 Jacobite uprising, got into some sort of minor trouble and managed to escape with the help of friends. He then went to live in France. So Clementina, in Europe, she was placed in a convent and was raised there. So the parallels with Flora McKeever are very, very striking. Clementina might be deceased by the time Scott writes this book, but family members of hers are most certainly still alive. So for that reason, maybe Scott felt he couldn't put Clementina in this book, and maybe he wanted to. So it's quite possible that Flora is supposed to be Clementina. It's also possible that this is just well understood by everybody, past and present, who reads this book. Although when I Googled that, I actually couldn't find anything talking about that. I couldn't find anybody saying that Flora McKeever represents Clementina Walkinshaw. There is, however, a fanfic out there. Well, it's a published novel, but it's basically a fanfic about Flora McKeever, who is in that story a close friend of Clementina Walkinshaw. I think that's a rather cool take on it. Flora McKeever maybe was actually a friend of Clementina, but my thought is that Scott actually intended Flora to be Clementina. Coming back to this theme that I just can't seem to get away from of The Lord of the Rings, I'm seeing a lot of Arwen and Éowyn in Flora and Rose. I think they've been mixed up a bit, because I think Arwen's personality is very much that of Rose, whereas Éowyn is very much Flora, but their physical appearances are actually the opposite way round. I do think it's there. The other thing is, when I'm looking through the court of France and what happened with Clementina Walkinshaw, there is a lot of involvement with the family of Rohan in France. They're just little details, and this is not disparaging Tolkien in any way. It's what we all do when we write. You get inspiration from real things. You take real situations, real scenarios, and honestly, as an author, I feel like Tolkien outstrips Scott. At this point, I definitely feel that Tolkien is the better author. I mean, Scott improves later on, that's for sure, and he lived in a different time, and writing has been honed in later years, so Tolkien had the advantage there. Plus, I'm comparing a later book of Tolkien's with the first book of Scott, so it's probably very unfair for me to say it, but all of these ideas that Scott has here, I am seeing in The Lord of the Rings. I think it's a good thing, and it's really helping me stick with Waverley. It's absolutely not the same thing, but there are so many similarities. And of course, having come to that, I do ask myself, is there a little bit of Bonnie Prince Charles in Aragorn? And there is kind of the displaced prince in the legitimate ruler who isn't on the throne, who has to make a decision whether he should try to take the throne back or not, whether his country needs him. There is a great deal there. And I'm very pleased to see it. But getting back to Charles Stewart and his personal life and his relationships, at this point, he was on top of the world. He had a mission, he was healthy, he was educated, he had abilities. It does look like he fell into some kind of romantic relationship here in Scotland, probably there at Holyrood Palace. So as far as this story is concerned, with the complete absence of Clementina Walkinshaw, and I haven't read this book, maybe she's about to appear in a later chapter, but at this point, with her not in it, I'm thinking Prince Charles and Flora are probably getting on very well just now. And he is the one that Flora is actually interested in, and the reason why she won't even look at Edward. Even if he wasn't, she's just a lowly Highland girl. She was certainly not important enough to be married to him. But as we all know, amongst royalty, there are different levels of relationship that a prince can have with all the women around him. So he can have a confirmed and long-term partner who he will never be able to marry. And he can have more casual relationships who might still have some influence with him. And I presume that Fergus is thinking Flora might fit into this category. And so we get to the end of the evening. It's getting very dark now. I'm in that last little patch of light in the house. There's a song that apparently they play at the end of a night that everyone in Scotland knows. It is called Good Night and Joy Be With You. The band played this. I gather this was a custom at balls. The last song is one that everybody knows is the final song, and that is everybody's signal to leave and go home. This is how they stop people from straggling and staying late, overstaying their welcome. So the song played, the Chevalier stood up and said good night, and Scott tells us that this was the last night of absolute pleasure they had before the fighting started. This was their final hurrah, the final moments of peace before the actual war. And that's the end of the chapter. My battery's going flat, so I don't think I can say anything here, and I've probably said it all throughout. But I do like the way this chapter ended. We know where we stand. We know where Edward stands. We know who is where. All the pieces have been placed, and we know what's about to happen. So once again, Scott did that well. He told us what's coming up. We have just enough information to anticipate it along with Edward. It was nicely written, nicely paced. I don't know the story of this war, so if there's any subtext there, I didn't really pick it up. But I think we know. We know that they're not very strong, but they're going forward anyway to face what's out there. So that's all I have to say.